My name is Stanley Harper. I am 70 years old, and yesterday afternoon, my phone lit up with a text message from my son, Colin. It read, "Plans changed, Dad. You are not coming on the cruise. Natalie wants only her family there." I did not reply. I did not shed a single tear. By the next morning, I had permanently frozen my credit card, sold the home I owned outright, and boarded a plane out of state. When my son and his wife returned from their little ocean getaway, they found their belongings rotting on the back porch and a stranger living in the house they thought was theirs. Before I tell you exactly how they destroyed their own lives, let me know where you are listening from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe disrespect should never be tolerated, especially from your own flesh and blood. I was folding my last linen shirt, placing it neatly into my suitcase. The Miami sun was going to be brutal, but I had been looking forward to this Caribbean cruise for 6 months. I had paid the initial deposit for the entire group, Colin, Natalie, and her parents. It was supposed to be a bonding trip. My phone vibrated on the wooden dresser. I wiped my hands on my slacks and picked it up. The message from Colin stared back at me. "Plans changed, Dad. You are not coming on the cruise. Natalie wants only her family there. I will swing by later to pick up the waterproof camera you bought. Do not wait up." I read it twice. The sheer audacity of it hung in the quiet air of my bedroom. He was kicking me off a vacation I had funded with my own retirement savings, simply because his wife did not want to look at me. I did not throw the phone. I did not call him to scream or beg. I sat on the edge of the mattress, the silence of the empty house pressing against my shoulders. For 4 years, I had swallowed my pride. I had swallowed the subtle insults, the eye rolls, the way Natalie complained about my cooking in my own kitchen. I picked up the phone again and dialed my bank. The automated voice prompted me to enter my account number. A representative answered immediately. I gave him my security verification and did not hesitate. "I need to permanently freeze the credit card ending in 4092, I said, my voice steady. "Yes, effective immediately. Report it as compromised." That specific card was the one tied to the cruise line. I had paid the initial $5,000 deposit, but the remaining $15,000 balance for the premium family suite and the luxury excursion packages was scheduled to be auto-drafted at the port terminal during check-in tomorrow morning. The representative confirmed the card was locked and deactivated. No future charges would go through. I hung up. A strange, cold calm washed over me. The doorbell rang, a sharp sound cutting through the thick silence of the house. I walked downstairs, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors I had installed with my own 2 hands. I opened the door. A man in a sharp gray suit stood on my porch holding a leather briefcase. He was a real estate investor, the kind who buys properties for cash, no questions asked. We had spoken briefly on the phone an hour earlier. I stepped aside and motioned for him to come in. The purge had officially begun. The investor walked through my living room, his eyes scanning the crown molding and the spacious, open layout. He did not care about the memories here. He only cared about the profit margin. He turned to me and offered a price that was a solid 30% below market value. It was a lowball offer designed to make a desperate seller flinch. I did not flinch. "I will take it," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "But I have 2 conditions. The funds must be wired into my account within 24 hours, and you take possession of the property tomorrow. You can change the locks the second the money clears." He blinked, clearly surprised by my lack of negotiation, then quickly pulled out the contract. As he arranged the paperwork on the kitchen island, I walked over to the mantel. A large silver-framed photograph of Colin and Natalie smiled back at me. They had moved into my house 4 years ago, claiming they just needed a few months to save up for a down payment on their own place. Months turned into years. They took over the master bedroom. They filled the garage with their junk. They lived rent-free eating the groceries I bought, while Natalie spent her paychecks on designer handbags, and Colin leased a luxury sports car to keep up appearances. I took the silver frame, removed the photograph, and dropped the picture straight into the trash can. I kept the frame. I walked upstairs to the master bedroom they had commandeered. I grabbed a stack of cheap cardboard boxes I had bought from the hardware store earlier. I did not fold their clothes. I did not organize their shoes. I swept Natalie's expensive cosmetics and Colin's designer suits into the boxes, taping them shut with aggressive efficiency. I dragged every single box down the stairs and shoved them out onto the back porch. The sky outside was growing dark, heavy gray clouds signaling an approaching storm. I did not care. I walked back to the kitchen, signed the thick stack of closing documents, and handed them back to the investor. He shook my hand, promising the wire transfer by morning. Once he left, I grabbed my single suitcase, walked out the front door, and locked it for the very last time. I hailed a passing taxi and told the driver to take me to the airport. As I watched my neighborhood blur past the window, my phone began to vibrate violently. The screen lit up with Colin's name. 1 missed call, 5 missed calls, 10. The auto draft at the cruise terminal must have just attempted to process. I sat in the airport lounge, a steaming cup of black coffee in my hand, watching planes take off into the night sky. My phone vibrated again. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, I tapped the screen and listened to the audio messages. Colin's first voicemail was laced with arrogant irritation. "Dad, call me back right now. We are at the port in Miami and the cruise line is saying the card declined. I need you to authorize the payment immediately." Natalie's parents are getting impatient. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I could picture the exact scene. The crowded, noisy terminal. Natalie's wealthy, judgmental parents tapping their feet, wondering why their son-in-law was sweating at the ticketing counter. Natalie glaring at him, her perfect vacation unraveling before it even began. The second voicemail arrived 10 minutes later. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a high-pitched panic. "Dad, pick up the phone. They are threatening to cancel our boarding passes. They need $15,000 right now, or they are throwing all of us out." Natalie is screaming at me. "Please, Dad, just unlock the card. We can talk about the message I sent later. I am sorry, okay? Just fix this." I did not move a muscle. I deleted the voicemails one by one. His panic was the absolute proof of his parasitic existence. He had dared to banish me from a trip I was paying for assuming my money would simply flow without my presence. He assumed I was a spineless old man who would just swallow the disrespect to keep the peace. He assumed wrong. My phone buzzed with the final text message. It was not an apology. It was a confirmation of his ultimate financial suicide. I had to take out a high-interest short-term loan online just to get us on the ship. "You ruined this trip for Natalie. Do not bother being at the house when we get back." I chuckled softly. A predatory loan. Colin had just signed his life away to a digital loan shark with a compounding interest rate that would bleed him dry in a matter of weeks, all to avoid looking poor in front of his arrogant wife and her snobby parents. And he told me not to be at the house. That was truly the perfect punchline. I boarded my flight, leaving the city, leaving the disrespect, and leaving my son to sail straight into a hurricane of his own making. The real tragedy for him was not the loan. It was what he would find when that luxury ship finally brought him back to reality. I sat by the window of my new high-rise apartment in a different state, sipping a hot cup of black coffee while the morning sun painted the skyline. I was 1,000 miles away from the home I had built, but I did not need to be standing on my old front porch to know exactly how the trap snapped shut. The real estate investor had called me the previous evening, thoroughly amused, to deliver a detailed account of the spectacle. Exactly 7 days after they boarded that luxury cruise on borrowed money, Colin and Natalie returned. They stepped out of a cheap rideshare vehicle, dragging their heavy luggage up the familiar driveway. Their skin was peeling from the intense Caribbean sun, but the vacation glow had already been entirely eclipsed by the crushing weight of their financial reality. They were coming back to their sanctuary, the rent-free fortress, where they could hide from the predatory loan Colin had taken out, just to step foot on that ship. They walked up the paved walkway, completely exhausted, their heads down. Colin dragged his suitcase up the porch steps and reached into his pocket. He pulled out his shiny brass key, the one I had given him 4 years ago, when he promised he only needed a few months to get back on his feet. He slid the key into the deadbolt. It did not turn. He jiggled the handle, frustrated, assuming the humidity had caused the old wood to swell. He tried again, pushing his shoulder against the heavy oak door. The lock held firm. It was a brand new mechanism installed the very morning I left town. Natalie let out an irritated sigh, dropping her designer travel bag onto the concrete. She complained about his incompetence, demanding he open the door so she could take a shower. But as she glanced to her right, her annoyance evaporated into pure, paralyzing confusion. Stacked haphazardly against the far brick wall of the porch were dozens of cheap cardboard boxes. They had been sitting there for a week. We had experienced a massive thunderstorm 3 days prior, and the cheap cardboard had surrendered to the rain. The boxes were saturated, sagging and tearing at the seams. Natalie walked over slowly, her breath catching in her throat as she recognized the contents spilling out onto the muddy concrete. Her expensive silk dresses, her imported cosmetics, her curated shoe collection, all thoroughly soaked and ruined. Next to her ruined wardrobe lay Colin's custom golf clubs and his tailored office suits completely exposed to the unforgiving elements. Colin abandoned the door and rushed over, panic finally seizing his features. He frantically tore open a soggy box, pulling out his expensive watch collection and his favorite cologne. He began shouting my name, assuming this was some sort of cruel punishment for leaving me behind. He pounded his fists against the heavy oak door, yelling for me to open up and stop acting like a child. The deadbolt clicked. The heavy door swung inward, but it was not his 70-year-old father standing in the foyer. A tall man in a crisp navy suit stood in the doorway holding a steaming mug of coffee. It was the investor, the new legal owner of the property. He looked at Colin with the cold, detached annoyance of a man interrupted during his morning routine. Colin froze, his fist still raised in the air. He demanded to know who the stranger was and what he was doing inside his house. The investor took a slow sip of his coffee. He did not raise his voice. He simply stated that he was the owner and that Colin was currently trespassing on private property. Natalie pushed past Colin, her voice shrill and dripping with her usual unearned authority. She screamed that the house belonged to her husband, that it was their family home, and she threatened to call the police to have the intruder arrested for breaking and entering. She crossed her arms, waiting for the man to cower. The investor simply smiled. It was a cold, corporate smile. He turned around, picked up a thick manila folder from the entryway table, and stepped back onto the porch. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and shoved it directly into Colin's chest. It was a certified copy of the final sale contract, complete with the county clerk's official seal. Colin read the document, his hands shaking so violently that the paper rattled. The color drained completely from his sunburned face. The document outlined the absolute transfer of ownership, signed, sealed, and legally binding. But the most devastating piece of information on that page was the name listed under the seller section. Stanley Harper, sole owner. Natalie snatched the paper from Colin's trembling hands. For 4 years, she had lived under the arrogant delusion that her name, or at least her husband's name, was somehow attached to the deed. She had convinced herself that because they paid for a few minor repairs and bought some modern furniture, they had established legal equity in the property. She believed it was their house and that I was simply a convenient, silent roommate who paid the property taxes. The stark black ink on the legal document shattered that fantasy in an instant. I owned the house outright, and I had every legal right to liquidate it without consulting them. The investor gave them exactly 2 minutes to clear their ruined belongings off his porch before he called the authorities to report them for trespassing. Then he shut the door, the heavy click of the new deadbolt echoing like a gunshot in the humid air. They were entirely homeless. The realization hit them with the force of a freight train. They had no house, they had no savings. They were buried under a mountain of high-interest debt from a vacation they could never afford. Natalie turned on Colin like a starving animal. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing down the quiet suburban street. She cursed him for being a failure, for allowing this to happen, for not securing their legal right to the home. She hurled every vicious insult she could muster, blaming him entirely for the fact that she was now standing in a puddle of muddy water with her ruined designer clothes. Colin stood there utterly pathetic, absorbing her verbal assault. But the shock quickly morphed into a desperate, dangerous rage. He was not a man who took responsibility for his own failures. He had spent his entire life being bailed out by my hard work. Instead of recognizing that his own arrogance had caused this catastrophe, his mind immediately searched for a way to manipulate the system. He looked at his screaming wife, gripped her by the shoulders, and told her to stop crying. He had a plan. He pulled out his phone and stared at the dark screen. He reasoned that I was a 70-year-old man who had suddenly and inexplicably sold his only asset for cash and vanished without a trace. In Colin's twisted mind, this was not the calculated move of a disrespected father. This was the erratic behavior of a confused, declining senior citizen. Colin declared that the sale of the house was entirely invalid. He told Natalie they were going straight to the police precinct. He was going to file a missing persons report. He was going to look the officers in the eye and swear under oath that his elderly father had been suffering from severe cognitive decline and extreme dementia. He planned to claim that a predatory real estate agent had taken advantage of my failing mental health to steal the family home. He was absolutely convinced that if he played the role of the terrified, loving son, the authorities would declare me legally incompetent, invalidate the real estate contract, and hand the property directly back to him. He grabbed his ruined suitcase and marched down the driveway, completely unaware that his decision to involve the authorities was exactly what I had anticipated. He was walking directly into a snare made of his own lies, and the steel jaws were already waiting to snap shut. I did not have to be sitting inside the interrogation room to witness the pathetic performance. Chief Miller called me the very next afternoon from his desk. He and I had been in the same bowling league a decade ago, and he took immense professional satisfaction in reading Colin's official police report back to me over the phone. Colin had marched into the precinct with Natalie clutching his arm, playing the role of the distraught and loving children to absolute perfection. He sat across from the chief, burying his face in his hands, forcing out a few theatrical tears. I knew those tears well. It was the exact same weeping routine he used when he was 19 and totaled his first car, knowing I would dip into my savings to buy him a new vehicle. He spun a tragic, elaborate tale of an elderly father rapidly losing his grip on reality. He claimed I had been wandering the streets at night, forgetting my own name and leaving the stove burners running. He painted a heartbreaking picture of a fragile old man who had been aggressively swindled by a predatory real estate firm. He demanded that the police invalidate the sale of my house, issue a statewide alert, and grant him immediate emergency guardianship over my estate. He begged them to find his poor sick father before I wandered into traffic. Chief Miller let him talk. He let Colin dig his own grave with every fabricated melodramatic detail. When Colin finally ran out of breath and dabbed his dry eyes with a tissue, the chief turned to his computer monitor. He did not offer a shoulder to cry on. He did not dispatch a search party or issue a warrant for the real estate investor. He simply hit a few keys, printed a single document, and slid it across the metal desk for Colin and Natalie to read. I had not just packed my bags and left town blindly. I had driven straight to that exact precinct the morning I sold the house. I had sat in Chief Miller's office, handed him a certified letter from my primary care physician proving I was in perfect physical and cognitive health, and filed a preemptive voluntary statement. I went on official police record stating that I was leaving the state of my own free will to escape the severe financial and emotional exploitation of my adult son and his wife. I made it absolutely clear to the authorities that I was not missing. I was not confused. And any attempt by Colin to claim otherwise was a fraudulent, desperate move to seize my assets. I knew Natalie had been whispering to the neighbors for months that I was getting forgetful, laying the groundwork to steal my autonomy. I saw their narrative building, so I burned it to ash before they could even strike the match. The color completely drained from Colin's face as he read my sworn statement. The illusion of the helpless father was instantly pulverized. Natalie tried to interject, raising her shrill voice to argue that I must have been coerced by the real estate agent, but the chief cut her off immediately. He leaned over his heavy desk and informed them that filing a false police report to manipulate a legal real estate transaction was a felony offense. He politely suggested they leave his precinct that very second before he decided to press criminal charges for wasting vital government resources. They did not argue. They practically sprinted out of the building. The humiliation was absolute and suffocating. They had walked through those glass doors expecting to use the law as a weapon to drag me back into my cage, only to find out I had already handed the police the shield. But the true crushing devastation did not hit them until they reached the sun-baked asphalt of the precinct parking lot. As Colin fumbled with the keys to their cheap rental car, Natalie's phone buzzed violently in her designer purse. She pulled it out, her eyes scanning the notification on the glowing screen. It was not a message of comfort from a concerned friend. It was an automated, unforgiving alert from a digital lending institution. The high-interest, short-term loan Colin had taken out at the cruise terminal was structured with brutal, predatory terms. They had arrogantly assumed they could just pay off the balance using my credit cards once they returned to my house, and sweet-talked me into opening my wallet again. But my cards were frozen, the house was sold, and the first massive installment had just been automatically deducted from their personal checking account. That single deduction triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. Their joint bank account was instantly overdrawn by thousands of dollars. The notification staring back at Natalie was a severe overdraft alert, followed immediately by an email stating that her own secret credit card bill was past due. While living rent-free under my roof, she had been quietly funneling her massive retail therapy debts onto a hidden card, assuming she could always rely on my groceries and free utilities to offset her reckless spending. She believed my financial stability was her permanent safety net. Now the net was gone. The ground beneath them had completely vanished. They were standing in a police parking lot, utterly homeless, legally cornered, and entirely broke. Natalie let out a scream of pure, unadulterated rage, hurling her phone at the rental car tire. She demanded to know how Colin was going to fix this financial disaster. Colin had no answers. He had never had to fix a real problem in his entire adult life, because I had always been there to sweep up his messes. Instead of facing the reality of his actions, his panicked mind immediately searched for someone else to blame, setting the perfect stage for his next disastrous mistake. I sat in the leather armchair of my new penthouse apartment in downtown Austin. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of a city that did not know my name and did not care about my past. The quiet hum of the central air conditioning was a stark contrast to the relentless chaos of the house I had just sold. I poured a glass of sparkling water just as the heavy mahogany door to my private study opened. Mr. Foster, my attorney, walked in carrying a thick leather briefcase. He was a man who spoke entirely in facts, numbers, and devastating legal consequences. He sat across from me and unclasped the briefcase. He pulled out a dense stack of financial forensic reports and slid them across the glass coffee table. "The trap we set is performing exactly as anticipated," he said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. I looked down at the neatly organized spreadsheets. 3 months before I sold my house, I had noticed a subtle discrepancy in my credit monitoring alerts. I had quietly hired Foster to run a comprehensive background check on my own Social Security number. What he found would have shattered an ordinary father. It simply hardened my resolve. Natalie had never respected my privacy. During the 4 years she lived under my roof, she frequently snooped through my home office while I was tending to the garden. She had found my tax documents. She had memorized my Social Security number. Armed with my personal data and an arrogant sense of entitlement, she had brazenly opened 2 secret credit accounts entirely in my name. She had routed the digital statements to a dummy email address, intercepting the physical mail before I ever walked to the mailbox. She had been quietly funding her luxury spa days and designer shoe habits on my dime, believing I was too old and technologically inept to ever notice the phantom lines of credit dragging down my financial portfolio. I often wondered if Colin knew about her secret spending. A part of me hoped he was just a fool, completely blind to his wife's criminal behavior. But the reality was that my son had always chosen the path of least resistance. He enjoyed the expensive dinners and the luxury items she brought home without ever questioning how a woman with a sporadic income could afford them. His willful ignorance made him a silent accomplice to her theft. They were a perfect match in their parasitism. When Foster originally brought this identity theft to my attention, his immediate legal advice was to freeze the accounts and press criminal charges right then and there. I refused. I told him to let the accounts remain open. I instructed him to put a silent tracking monitor on every single transaction. If I had confronted them immediately, Natalie would have cried, Colin would have begged, and they would have spun a pathetic narrative about a simple family misunderstanding. I did not want a tearful apology. I wanted an ironclad federal conviction. By allowing her to continue using the fraudulent cards across state lines and through digital banking networks, we were no longer dealing with a simple domestic dispute over stolen cash. We were building a massive, undeniable case for federal identity theft and wire fraud. Now Foster tapped a specific line on the most recent bank statement. The numbers were staggering. After being thrown out of my house and publicly humiliated at the police precinct, Natalie had absolutely refused to lower her standard of living. Instead of finding a cheap roadside motel or sleeping in their rental car, her bruised ego demanded luxury. She could not bear the thought of looking like a failure in front of the hotel staff. She had marched directly into a 5-star downtown hotel and slapped down the fraudulent credit card tied to my identity. Foster showed me the itemized receipts. $200 for a deep tissue massage, $80 for a room service breakfast, $500 for a boutique clothing charge in the hotel lobby. She was treating my stolen identity like an endless fountain of wealth, actively soothing her bruised ego with my money, while pretending to be a victim of my sudden departure. In the past 48 hours alone, she had racked up thousands of dollars in premium suite charges and valet parking. She was ordering vintage wine to her room, while Colin was likely pacing the floor, desperately trying to figure out how to navigate their sudden homelessness. Natalie assumed she had found a brilliant loophole. She thought she was outsmarting me by using a card I supposedly did not know existed. She thinks she is surviving on a secret lifeline, Foster said, adjusting his glasses. But every time she swipes that card at the hotel concierge, she is adding another month to a potential federal prison sentence. The digital footprint is undeniable. She is forging your signature on the electronic receipts. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the long list of charges. A cold smile crept across my face. The sheer audacity of her entitlement was breathtaking, but it was also the exact weapon I needed to finalize their destruction. They had tried to paint me as a confused, helpless old man who could not manage his own affairs. They had gone to the police to strip me of my autonomy. They were about to learn that I had been orchestrating their absolute ruin with surgical precision. I looked at Foster and gave a single nod. "The evidence is complete," I said. "We have given them enough rope, and they have successfully tied the knot themselves. Draft the official legal notices and prepare the lawsuit." Foster gathered the documents and placed them back into his leather briefcase. He promised that the preliminary injunctions and the formal demands for restitution would be finalized before the end of the day. As he walked out of my apartment, I turned back to the window, watching the city traffic move far below. Colin and Natalie were currently wrapping themselves in stolen luxury, believing they had found a temporary sanctuary from the storm. They had no idea that a legal hurricane was already heading straight for their hotel lobby. I was standing on this balcony of my new apartment, watching the morning traffic weave through the streets of Austin, when my phone rang. It was Foster. His voice was as crisp and unreadable as the legal documents he drafted, but I could hear the faint trace of professional satisfaction in his tone. The process server had just made contact. I stepped back inside, sliding the glass door shut, and listened as my attorney detailed exactly how the trap had snapped shut around my son. Colin and Natalie were standing in the opulent lobby of their downtown hotel, surrounded by marble pillars and crystal chandeliers they had no business standing under. Foster had a private investigator stationed in the lobby to ensure the delivery went smoothly and to monitor their immediate reaction. According to the report, Colin was pacing furiously near the concierge desk, his eyes glued to his phone screen, no doubt staring at the catastrophic negative balance in his checking account caused by his predatory loan. Natalie, completely oblivious to the financial guillotine hovering over her neck, was casually walking toward him, carrying a branded shopping bag from one of the expensive hotel boutiques. She had just used my stolen identity to buy another piece of meaningless luxury. She was smiling. That smile vanished the second a man in a plain gray suit stepped directly into their path. The man did not introduce himself. He simply looked at my son, asked if he was Colin Harper, and when Colin absent-mindedly nodded, the man thrust a thick, heavy manila envelope into his chest. "You have been served," the man said, turning on his heel and walking out the glass doors before Colin could even process what had just happened. Colin tore open the envelope right there in the lobby. I had instructed Foster to make the language in those documents as terrifying and as legally suffocating as possible. It was a formal demand for immediate restitution, but it was drafted with the heavy looming threat of a federal criminal indictment. The pages outlined the exact dates, times, and locations where Natalie had fraudulently used my social security number to open secret lines of credit. It detailed the thousands of dollars she had siphoned from my identity to fund her spa treatments, her designer clothes, and their lavish weekend getaways. But more importantly, the document laid out the specific federal statutes they had violated: wire fraud, identity theft, elder financial exploitation. The ultimatum at the bottom of the final page was absolute. They had exactly 48 hours to contact Foster's office and establish a legally binding repayment plan for the entirety of the stolen funds. If they failed to respond, or if they attempted to flee, Foster would bypass civil litigation entirely and hand the mountain of evidence directly over to the federal authorities for criminal prosecution. They were not looking at a bad credit score. They were looking at years in a federal penitentiary. The investigator reported that Colin physically staggered backward until his shoulders hit a marble pillar. He stared at the papers, his sunburned face draining of all color. He shoved the documents into Natalie's hands, his voice trembling as he demanded to know what she had done. The illusion of their perfect upper-class marriage shattered right there on the polished lobby floor. Natalie scanned the legal threats, and true to her parasitic nature, she immediately tried to deflect. She did not apologize. She did not express remorse. She hissed at Colin, telling him to keep his voice down so the hotel staff would not hear. When he demanded an explanation for the secret credit cards, she turned the blame entirely on him. She threw his own inadequacies in his face, reminding him that he was the one who could not afford to buy them a house, that he was the one who forced her to live with an old man, and that she only opened the cards because he had promised her a lifestyle he was incapable of providing. She claimed I was just a senile old fool who would never notice the missing money anyway. She pointed her manicured finger at his chest and told him it was his job as her husband to fix this mess, demanding he call me to apologize and make the lawsuit go away. They argued viciously, their voices echoing in hushed, venomous tones. Colin was trapped. He knew he could not call me. I had blocked his number, and even if I had not, he knew I would not answer. He was staring down the barrel of a federal investigation, completely broke, homeless, and married to a woman who would gladly watch him drown if it meant she could stay on her sinking pedestal. But I knew my son. I had raised him, and I knew the darkest corners of his cowardice. Colin had never once in his 35 years taken responsibility for his own failures. Whenever he backed his car into a fence as a teenager, he blamed the lighting. Whenever he failed a college course, he blamed the professor. Now, facing total ruin, his mind desperately searched for a shortcut, a way to cheat the system instead of paying his debts. If he admitted to this fraud, his life was over. But as he stared at the legal documents threatening his freedom, a sinister realization washed over him. The entire lawsuit, the sale of the house, the frozen bank accounts, all of it hinged on the fact that I was a competent, autonomous adult making sound financial decisions. Colin realized that if I was not legally competent, none of my actions over the past week would hold up in a court of law. If he could prove that I had lost my mind long before I sold the house, he could argue that the credit cards were simply opened to help manage the expenses of a deteriorating father. He could claim the house sale was invalid and have the money returned to him as my primary caretaker. He could wipe away the federal charges under the guise of a tragic family misunderstanding. But to do that, he needed proof. He needed a document proving I was suffering from severe dementia, and he needed it to be backdated. He did not have a legitimate doctor who would ever sign such a lie. But Colin remembered a guy from his past. Years ago, before he met Natalie, he used to run with a crowd that skirted the edges of the law. He knew a man who specialized in creating fake driver's licenses, forged bank statements, and counterfeit legal documents for people desperate enough to pay his exorbitant fees. Standing in the lobby of a luxury hotel he was paying for with stolen money, Colin pulled out his phone. He did not call a lawyer. He did not call the police to turn himself in. He dialed the number of a known criminal forger. He was going to buy a fraudulent medical power of attorney. He was going to manufacture a fake medical history proving I was completely insane. It was the most despicable, treacherous decision he could possibly make against his own father. But as I listened to Foster outline the impending collision, I did not feel a shred of fear. I only felt a deep, profound anticipation. Because Colin was about to commit his final fatal mistake, and he had no idea that I was already waiting for him to fall into the abyss. The heavy rain washed over the city outskirts, turning the cracked pavement of a forgotten strip mall into a dark, muddy mirror. I was sitting comfortably in my secure apartment across town, but I saw every single detail of the transaction in stunning, high resolution just a few hours later. Foster had placed his best private investigator on Colin the second the process server handed over the lawsuit in the hotel lobby. We knew exactly how a rat behaves when it is trapped in a corner. It does not reflect on its mistakes. It gnaws through the walls. Colin had driven his cheap rental car to a rundown neon-lit diner miles away from the affluent downtown district he preferred. He walked through the glass doors looking entirely out of place in his wrinkled designer slacks and his rain-soaked jacket. He sat at a sticky laminate table in the far back corner. Across from him sat a man whose name did not matter, a man who made a lucrative living providing fraudulent documents for desperate people. Colin pulled a thick white envelope from his inner jacket pocket and slid it across the table. It contained $5,000 in cash. It was the absolute last bit of liquid capital he had managed to secure from his predatory loan before the automatic deductions had frozen his bank accounts completely. He was investing his final lifeline into a federal crime. The forger took the envelope, counted the bills with practiced efficiency, and slid a crisp, official-looking document back across the table. It was a heavily fabricated medical power of attorney. The document was an absolute masterpiece of deceit. It featured a forged signature from a non-existent neurologist and a counterfeit state notary seal. It was backdated by 8 months, specifically designed to prove that I was suffering from severe advanced cognitive decline long before I ever sold my house or froze my credit cards. The fake document granted Colin absolute unmitigated legal authority over my medical care and my entire financial portfolio. As I watched the photographs of my son eagerly inspecting the fake document, a bitter, cold realization washed over me. This pathetic scene was exactly who Colin was. This was his fundamental nature. When he was 22 years old, he was caught blatantly plagiarizing his final university thesis. Instead of accepting the failing grade, dropping his pride, and retaking the semester, he chose the path of deceit. He purchased a stolen medical pad and forged a doctor note claiming he had been hospitalized with a severe illness to force the university to grant him an emergency medical withdrawal. I had found out about the forgery. Instead of letting him face the academic board and take his punishment, I quietly stepped in. I paid the tuition for him to retake the entire year. I buried my extreme disappointment under the misguided guise of being a supportive father. I thought I was protecting his future. In reality, I was teaching him that his lies would always be subsidized. I taught him that rules and consequences were only meant for other people. Now entirely cut off from my wallet, and facing the terrifying reality of a federal lawsuit, he was simply reverting to the only survival skill he had ever truly mastered: fraud. Colin sat in that dingy diner staring at the fraudulent paperwork with absolute relief. He thought he was brilliant. He thought he had found the perfect shortcut to erase his debts and put me back in my cage. He had absolutely no idea that the man sitting 2 booths away, pretending to read a sports magazine over a plate of cold eggs, was a highly paid private investigator. The investigator was equipped with a micro camera built directly into the zipper of his dark jacket. He captured the exchange of the cash. He captured the face of the known criminal forger. He captured Colin holding the fraudulent legal document up to the dim diner light. The investigator had also placed a highly sensitive directional microphone in his breast pocket. He recorded clear, undeniable audio of Colin explicitly asking the forger if the fake notary stamp would hold up against a bank manager's scrutiny. My son was committing a major federal crime in broad daylight, fully convinced he was an invisible mastermind. He was crossing the line from a negligent, arrogant son into a documented, premeditated felon. He was actively conspiring to commit elder fraud, identity theft, and document forgery. Colin stood up from the sticky booth. He did not look guilty. He did not look conflicted. He looked victorious. He believed that single piece of paper was his golden ticket back to a life of unearned luxury. He believed it would magically invalidate the lawsuit Foster had just served him. He believed it would force the real estate investor to hand back the keys to my house. And he believed it would grant him total control over my bank accounts, allowing him to wipe away his massive debts with a single signature. He walked out of the diner clutching the forged document tightly against his chest to protect the fake ink from the rain. He got into his rental car, his hands trembling with adrenaline and anticipation. He did not drive back to the hotel to show Natalie his brilliant acquisition. He typed the address of my primary financial institution into his navigation system. He was driving straight to the bank. He planned to walk into the lobby, slam that fake medical document onto the branch manager desk, and demand that they freeze all of my assets and grant him immediate access to my funds. He thought he was about to execute a flawless checkmate. He was completely unaware that he was walking his own head directly into the guillotine, and I was already standing there waiting to pull the lever. Colin drove his rental car into the sprawling parking lot of my primary financial institution. The relentless morning rain had finally stopped, leaving the asphalt slick and reflecting the gray sky. He killed the engine and took a deep, steadying breath, clutching the forged medical power of attorney tightly in his sweating hand. He walked through the heavy glass doors of the bank with the unearned, arrogant confidence of a man who believed he had just outsmarted the entire world. He bypassed the standard teller line completely. He marched directly toward the glass-walled office of the branch manager, a man who had personally handled my investment portfolios for over 15 years. Colin pushed the heavy mahogany office door open without bothering to knock. He threw the fraudulent document down onto the polished desk. He demanded that the manager freeze all outbound transfers immediately and grant him full, unrestricted access to my checking and savings accounts. He played the part of the grieving, overwhelmed son to absolute perfection. He claimed I had suffered a sudden, severe mental collapse, that I was wandering the state as a danger to myself, and that he desperately needed to secure my liquid assets to pay for specialized psychiatric care. He leaned over the desk, attempting to project an aura of absolute authority. The branch manager did not act surprised. He did not offer his sympathies or rush to comfort my son. He simply picked up the crisp sheet of paper and adjusted his reading glasses. He silently read over the forged signature of the non-existent neurologist. He ran his thumb over the counterfeit state notary seal. Colin stood there tapping his foot against the carpet, demanding that the verification process be expedited because he had urgent outstanding medical bills to cover. He was entirely expecting the manager to nod sympathetically, type a few passwords, and hand over the keys to my kingdom. Instead, the manager calmly turned to his computer monitor and typed in a sequence of commands. He scanned the barcode that the forger had carelessly added to the bottom of the page. The system did not process the request. The manager looked back at Colin and stated in a flat monotone voice that there was a severe legal irregularity with the documentation provided. Colin immediately raised his voice, his manufactured grief transforming into genuine panicked anger. He threatened to sue the bank for negligence. He slammed his fist onto the polished wood, insisting that the legal document gave him absolute unquestionable authority over my entire estate. The heavy oak door connecting the manager office to the private executive conference room clicked open. Mr. Foster stepped out, impeccably dressed in his tailored charcoal suit, holding a slim digital tablet in his right hand. Colin froze completely. He recognized my attorney instantly from the horrifying paperwork he had been served in the hotel lobby just yesterday. Foster did not raise his voice. He walked over to the desk, picked up the forged medical power of attorney, and looked at it with an expression of absolute disgust. He turned to my son and stated that submitting a fabricated legal document to a federally insured financial institution was a severe prosecuting felony. Colin stumbled backward, his voice cracking as he loudly insisted the paperwork was completely authentic. Foster did not argue. He simply tapped the screen of his digital tablet and placed it on the desk facing Colin. The bright screen displayed a high-resolution photograph taken just 2 hours earlier. It showed Colin sitting in the dim, dirty booth of the roadside diner, handing a thick envelope of cash directly to the known criminal forger. Foster casually swiped his finger across the screen to reveal the next piece of evidence. It was a crystal-clear audio waveform. Foster tapped play. The small speaker broadcasted Colin's own voice echoing in the quiet bank office, explicitly asking the criminal if the fake notary stamp would pass a strict bank manager inspection. Colin felt the blood drain entirely from his head. His knees buckled slightly, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the back of a leather guest chair just to stay standing. Foster looked at him with eyes as cold as absolute zero. He calmly explained that the state notary seal stamped on the document belonged to a woman who had been deceased for 6 years. He added that his private investigator had already forwarded the diner surveillance footage to the local police department and that federal authorities were being notified of the attempted bank fraud. The branch manager reached under his desk and pressed the silent security alarm. 2 armed guards stationed in the lobby immediately turned and began walking briskly toward the glass office. Colin realized in a fraction of a second that he was not just going to lose the money. He was about to be handcuffed, dragged out of the bank in front of dozens of staring witnesses, and thrown into a federal holding cell. Blind, absolute panic overrode any remaining shred of his arrogance. Before the security guards could reach the office door, Colin shoved his way past Foster, knocking the heavy leather chair to the floor. He sprinted out of the glass office, his dress shoes slipping frantically on the polished marble tile. The security guards shouted for him to stop, but adrenaline fueled his sheer cowardice. He burst through the main exit, throwing his shoulder aggressively against the heavy glass doors, and sprinted across the wet parking lot toward his rental car. He scrambled into the driver's seat, gasping for air, his hands shaking so uncontrollably he could barely press the ignition button. He threw the car into reverse tires, screeching against the wet pavement, and sped out of the parking lot, just as the distant, terrifying wail of police sirens began to echo down the busy street. He had escaped the immediate physical arrest, but he knew the devastating truth. He was completely out of moves. He was a fugitive with absolutely no money, no home, and irrefutable video evidence of his federal crimes sitting right on my lawyer's desk. He drove recklessly back to the luxury downtown hotel, running 2 red lights in his desperation. He burst into the premium suite where Natalie was sitting on the edge of the king-sized bed, casually inspecting her recent designer purchases. Colin was hyperventilating, dripping with nervous sweat, screaming that they had to pack their things and run immediately. He confessed that the forgery had failed catastrophically, that the bank knew absolutely everything, and that the police were likely already drafting a warrant for his arrest. Natalie stared at him in absolute paralyzed horror. Her entire world of unearned luxury and effortless privilege was disintegrating right before her eyes. The crushing realization that she was married to a man who was about to go to federal prison finally sank in. The safety net was not just gone. It had been replaced by a concrete floor. But instead of packing her bags and fleeing into obscurity with her husband, Natalie made a viciously calculated, venomous decision. She knew she could not fight the banking establishment, and she knew she could not fight my ruthless legal team. The only arena where she held any remaining fraction of power was the court of public opinion. If she was going to go down, she was determined to drag my reputation down into the mud with her. She grabbed her smartphone, completely ignoring Colin's frantic, pathetic attempts to stuff his clothes into a suitcase. She opened her social media accounts, her eyes narrowing with malicious intent. She decided to play the ultimate tragic victim. She began typing a long, tearful, heavily fabricated manifesto designed to completely destroy my character. She prepared to broadcast a vicious lie to thousands of people, claiming I was a monstrous, abusive father who had cruelly thrown them out onto the streets without warning. She wanted to incite a digital mob against me, hoping public pressure would force me to drop the lawsuit. She had absolutely no idea that her digital tantrum was exactly the catalyst I needed to drop the final devastating hammer. Natalie was not a brilliant strategist, but she inherently understood the weaponization of public sympathy. Confined to a cheap roadside motel with her ruined designer clothes and a husband facing imminent federal indictment, she decided to play her final desperate card. She drafted a long, highly emotional manifesto and posted it to every community group, neighborhood forum, and social platform she could access. She painted a tragic, completely fabricated portrait of her current reality. According to her digital narrative, she and my son had spent the last 4 years tirelessly caring for an increasingly volatile, abusive father. She claimed that without any warning or provocation, I had suffered a severe mental break, illegally sold the family home out from under them, and cast them out onto the streets, with nothing but the clothes on their backs. She accompanied the post with a carefully staged photograph of herself, standing in the rain next to the soaked, ruined cardboard boxes on the back porch, her face buried in her hands. It was a masterclass in victimhood. Within hours, the post went viral across our old social circles. The comments poured in, dripping with outrage and blind sympathy. People who had never even met me were publicly calling for my arrest. Extended members of her own family began organizing a digital fundraising campaign to help the poor victimized couple secure emergency housing and legal representation. Foster called me immediately, his voice tight with professional irritation, offering to draft a formal cease and desist letter for defamation and file an emergency injunction to halt the fraudulent fundraiser. I told my attorney to put his pen down. Legal letters take days to process and often make you look defensive. The internet moves in seconds, and a lie this massive does not need a lawyer to destroy it. It only needs the unvarnished truth. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, opened my laptop, and created a blank, anonymous digital account. I did not write a long, emotional defense. I did not justify my actions, explain my financial decisions, or beg the community for understanding. Arguing with a liar only validates their illusion and gives them the attention they crave. Instead, I uploaded exactly 2 high-resolution photographs directly into the top comment section of her viral post, and I systematically tagged every single local news outlet, community leader, and family member who had shared her fictitious story. The first photograph was a crystal-clear screenshot of the text message Colin had sent me the afternoon before the cruise. The message explicitly stated that I was banned from the vacation I had completely funded because Natalie only wanted her side of the family there, and it arrogantly ordered me not to wait up for them at my own house. The second photograph was the official cruise line invoice. It displayed the premium family suite, the luxury excursion packages, and the expensive dining upgrades. But the most devastating detail was printed in bold black ink at the very top of the receipt. The entire vacation was booked, reserved, and paid for exclusively under the name Stanley Harper. I hit send, closed my laptop, and went for a long, quiet walk around my new neighborhood. I did not need to sit and watch the digital carnage unfold to know exactly what was happening. Facts are absolute. By the time I returned to my apartment an hour later, Natalie's carefully constructed narrative had violently imploded. The internet is a fickle, ruthless judge. The moment the community saw the undeniable proof that Natalie had unapologetically banished the very man financing her extravagant lifestyle, the sympathy morphed into overwhelming, vicious outrage. The same people who had been donating to her fraudulent fundraiser began reporting her account for financial scamming. Her comment section became a tidal wave of mockery, disgust, and demands for accountability. Extended family members who had previously rushed to her defense were now publicly demanding their money back, humiliated that they had been duped. Natalie frantically tried to delete the negative comments, but the screenshots had already spread beyond her control. In a blind panic, she completely deactivated all of her social media profiles, effectively silencing herself and sealing her own social destruction. She had tried to burn my reputation to the ground, but the wind shifted and the flames consumed her entirely. Later that evening, as the city lights flickered to life outside my window, my phone buzzed. It was a blocked number, but I knew exactly who was on the other end. I accepted the call and remained perfectly silent. Colin did not sound angry. He did not sound arrogant. He sounded like a man who was drowning in a pitch-black ocean. He had no money, no home, a looming federal indictment, and a wife who had just turned them both into a public laughingstock. His voice cracked as he begged me not to hang up. He pleaded for a chance to sit down and talk like adults. He asked for a formal family mediation, promising he would do whatever it took to make things right and clear the air. He thought he was inviting me to a negotiation table where he could leverage our shared blood to beg for his old life back. He assumed my silence meant I was softening. I told him I would have Foster send over the time and the address for a neutral legal office the following afternoon. I accepted his invitation, knowing full well that Colin and Natalie were not walking into a mediation. They were walking blindly into their final execution. The glow of my laptop screen illuminated the dark study. When my phone vibrated against the glass desk, the caller identification displayed an unknown number. I knew who it was. The digital blockade I had erected around them was absolute, leaving them with no choice but to use a burner phone or a motel landline. I pressed accept and brought the receiver to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply let the dead silence stretch across the cellular connection. Colin spoke first. His voice was a fragile, trembling whisper, completely stripped of the arrogant entitlement he had paraded at the cruise terminal. He did not sound like a man demanding his inheritance. He sounded like a terrified boy drowning in a pitch-black ocean. He begged me not to hang up. He pleaded for a formal family mediation, swearing that he and Natalie wanted to sit down like adults, clear the air, and make everything right. He practically choked on his own tears as he promised to do whatever it took to earn back my trust. For over 3 decades, whenever Colin pushed his boundaries and found himself facing the severe consequences of his own actions, I had been the one to flinch. I had been the safety net that caught him before he hit the concrete. He expected me to raise my voice. He expected me to deliver a harsh, emotional lecture about respect and family values. To him, an angry father was a caring father. An angry father could still be manipulated. I did not give him a lecture. I did not offer a single word of comfort. My voice was as cold and flat as a slab of polished marble. I told him I would accept his request for mediation. I provided the address of a neutral corporate law office in the financial district and set the time for exactly noon the following day. I told him if he was 1 minute late, the door would be locked. I disconnected the call before he could even utter a word of gratitude. I immediately dialed Foster. The time for gathering evidence and blocking their desperate counterattacks was over. It was time to close the snare. I instructed my attorney to draft what we had privately deemed the final contract. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the glittering city lights. I felt an absolute, unshakable clarity. The father who had quietly endured 4 years of disrespect, who had swallowed Natalie's vicious insults in his own kitchen, no longer existed. That yielding, passive man had died the moment I read that text message about the cruise. In his place stood a cold, meticulous strategist. I told Foster to bring every single piece of financial evidence, the forged signatures, the hotel receipts, and the surveillance footage from the bank and the diner. I wanted the documents stacked like bricks on the conference room table. Early the next morning, my private investigator sent me a final brief update. It was a photograph taken outside a cheap local thrift store. Colin and Natalie were walking out carrying plastic shopping bags. They had actively decided to shed their expensive designer clothes. They had purchased modest, faded, ill-fitting garments. They were deliberately dressing the part of the humbled, destitute children. It was a calculated, manipulative wardrobe change. Natalie planned to hide her usual arrogance behind a facade of exhaustion and humility. Colin planned to use his sunburned, defeated appearance to trigger my paternal instincts. They honestly believed this was just another performance. They had convinced themselves that this mediation was a negotiation table where they could trade a few strategic tears and a hollow apology for a complete dismissal of the federal lawsuit. They thought they could cry their way back into my wallet and manipulate me into handing them a massive settlement check just to keep the family peace. I arrived at the corporate law office 30 minutes early. The conference room was impeccably sterile, encased in thick, soundproof glass. I took my seat at the head of the long mahogany table. Foster sat directly to my right, his leather briefcase resting ominously on the polished wood. We sat in perfect silence, waiting. Precisely at noon, the heavy glass doors opened. Colin and Natalie walked into the room. They looked utterly pathetic in their cheap, borrowed clothes. They kept their heads bowed, their shoulders slumped, projecting an aura of profound sorrow and deep remorse. They took their seats across from me, refusing to make direct eye contact, playing the role of the broken, repentant children to absolute perfection. They took a deep breath, preparing to launch into their carefully rehearsed, tearful monologue. They thought they were sitting down for a simple family reconciliation. They had absolutely no idea that they had just willingly walked into a legal guillotine and my hand was already resting firmly on the release lever. The heavy glass door of the conference room clicked shut, sealing us inside a perfectly sterile, soundproof box high above the financial district. The ambient noise of the bustling city streets vanished entirely, replaced by a suffocating, clinical silence. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table, my posture straight, my hands resting flat against the cool, polished wood. Foster sat immediately to my right. He was as still as a statue, his expression completely unreadable, his leather briefcase resting out of sight. Colin and Natalie stood awkwardly near the entrance, hesitating as if they were waiting for a warm invitation to enter their own home. They were wearing the cheap, faded clothing my private investigator had watched them purchase at a local thrift store just hours prior. Colin wore a wrinkled, oversized button-down shirt, and Natalie was dressed in a plain, faded cotton blouse that clashed aggressively with her usual polished aesthetic. They had clearly spent a considerable amount of time perfecting this miserable, broken appearance. Colin took a hesitant step forward. He reached his arms out slightly, his eyes shining with manufactured tears. He fully expected me to stand up from my leather chair, embrace him, and apologize for the harsh reality of the past few days. He was waiting for the familiar, yielding father who always stepped in to absorb the impact of his mistakes. I did not stand. I did not offer my hand. I simply stared at him with the cold, detached gaze of a corporate auditor evaluating a bankrupt asset. I raised my hand and gestured silently toward the 2 empty leather chairs positioned directly across from me. They sat down, the thick leather creaking loudly in the quiet room. They kept their heads bowed, playing the role of the terrified, repentant children to absolute perfection. Natalie was the first to break the heavy silence. She let out a small, trembling sob, burying her face in her hands. She launched into a carefully rehearsed, highly emotional monologue about how utterly difficult and traumatizing the past few days had been. She described the horror of standing in the pouring rain, the sheer humiliation of having their belongings ruined on the back porch, and the terror of sleeping in a cheap, unsanitary motel room because they had nowhere else to go. She wept as she talked about how much she missed our home, casually slipping in the word "our," as if trying to quietly reestablish her claim over the property I had already liquidated. She looked up at me, her eyes brimming with crocodile tears, begging for a fresh start. She swore that they had learned their lesson, that the shock of being homeless had changed their perspective, and that they just wanted their family back. As I watched her weep, a very specific memory surfaced in my mind. 3 years ago, Natalie had carelessly backed her leased luxury sport utility vehicle into a concrete retaining wall because she was distracted by a text message. She had sat at my kitchen table crying those exact same tears, sobbing about how the massive insurance deductible would completely ruin them financially. I had written her a check for $2,000 that very afternoon just to stop her crying and to save my son the stress of dealing with an angry wife. That was the old Stanley. That was the man who regularly traded his hard-earned money for a fragile, temporary illusion of peace. I let her cry. I did not offer her a tissue from the box sitting in the center of the table. I did not offer a single word of comfort, sympathy, or reassurance. I simply let her pathetic theatrical performance echo in the sterile room until she finally ran out of breath and the tears dried up. The silence returned heavier and infinitely more oppressive than before. Colin looked up at me, a flash of genuine confusion bleeding through his sorrowful expression. He was waiting for his cue. He was waiting for the familiar, predictable moment where I would soften, sigh heavily, and offer a financial solution to make their pain go away. I turned my head slightly toward Foster. My attorney did not speak. He simply lifted a thick, heavy manila folder from his lap and placed it directly in front of me. I rested my palm flat against the heavy cardstock. "You asked for a mediation," I said, my voice perfectly level, utterly devoid of any paternal warmth. "You asked to sit down like adults and clear the air. So let us clear the air." I pushed the folder. It slid smoothly across the polished mahogany, coming to a halt exactly an inch from Colin's trembling fingers. Colin let out a long, shaky exhale. A faint, relieved smile flickered across his sunburned face. He honestly believed he had won. He looked at that thick envelope and saw a miraculous lifeline. He assumed it contained a newly drafted lease agreement for a different property, or perhaps a massive settlement check designed to buy their silence and restore the comfortable family dynamic. He thought his thrift store costume and his wife's theatrical tears had successfully manipulated the senile old man one last time. He reached out and flipped open the heavy cover of the folder. He did not find a deed to a new house. He did not find a cashier's check. Colin's eyes darted across the crisp, stark white pages resting on top of the stack. His faint smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. The breath hitched violently in his throat, a sharp gasping sound that made Natalie jump in her seat. Staring back at him was a perfectly itemized forensic financial ledger. On the left side of the page was a detailed, unforgiving breakdown of the predatory high-interest digital loan he had authorized at the cruise terminal, complete with the compounding interest rates that were currently bleeding his bank accounts dry. But it was the right side of the page that made the blood drain entirely from his face. It was the undeniable, federally traced transaction history of Natalie's secret credit cards. Every fraudulent signature, every luxury hotel charge, every stolen dollar tied directly to my Social Security number was highlighted in bright, aggressive ink, legally binding them to a mountain of criminal debt. Foster did not look up from the crisp pages of the financial ledger. His voice was steady and clinical, carrying the precise weight of an executioner reading a list of final charges. He began to recite the itemized transactions line by line. $4,200 at a luxury handbag boutique in downtown Miami. $850 at a high-end steakhouse, $1,200 at an exclusive coastal resort spa. The dates and timestamps were read aloud, echoing against the soundproof glass of the conference room. As I listened to the exorbitant numbers, a very distinct, bitter memory surfaced. Foster read out a transaction from the second Tuesday of last month. Natalie had spent over $900 on imported cosmetics in a single afternoon. I remembered that exact Tuesday perfectly. I had been sitting at my own kitchen island, eating a 99-cent cup of instant ramen noodles for dinner. Colin had come to me that morning rubbing the back of his neck, claiming his paycheck was delayed, and they were desperately short on the utility bill. He had begged me to cover the electricity so the power would not be shut off. I had quietly skipped refilling my own blood pressure medication that week, just to ensure they had a comfortable home. All the while, Natalie had been swiping my stolen identity across a luxury makeup counter. Natalie slammed her hands down on the mahogany table, completely unable to endure the suffocating pressure of the undeniable evidence. She threw her head back and let out a shrill, indignant laugh, attempting to pivot back into her role as the righteous victim. She pointed an accusing finger across the table at me. She shrieked that I was a liar, insisting that I had explicitly authorized every single one of those purchases. She desperately claimed that I had promised her a generous monthly allowance for helping take care of the house, and that my declining mental state was simply making me forget our verbal agreements. She looked at Foster, demanding he close the folder, shouting that a few misunderstood credit card charges were a family matter, not a federal crime. Foster did not argue. He did not raise his voice to match her rising hysteria. He simply reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a slim digital tablet. He placed it flat on the table facing the two of them and tapped the screen. It was not a spreadsheet this time. It was a high-definition security recording from the branch manager office at my bank, captured just a few days prior. The video began to play. The crisp, amplified audio filled the silent conference room. It was Colin's voice. We watched and listened as my son aggressively slammed the fraudulent medical power of attorney onto the bank manager desk. We heard the sheer, unadulterated arrogance in his tone as he lied through his teeth, claiming his elderly father had completely lost his mind. We heard him demand total unrestricted access to my entire life savings, openly attempting to execute a massive federal bank fraud using forged legal documents. The recording played out entirely, leaving absolutely no room for misinterpretation, no shadow of a doubt, and no possible defense. The echo of Colin's voice faded, plunging the room back into a heavy, suffocating silence. Natalie stared at this dark screen of the tablet, her eyes wide with absolute horror. She had known Colin was trying to access my accounts, but she had not realized he had been foolish enough to commit a documented, undeniably amateur federal crime on high-definition bank security cameras. She realized in that exact fraction of a second that Colin was not just broke. He was legally radioactive. If she stayed tethered to him, he would drag her straight into a federal penitentiary. The sheer panic overrode whatever fragile loyalty still existed in their marriage. Natalie whipped her head around and glared at her husband with an expression of pure, unfiltered venom. She did not defend him. She did not offer a united front. She immediately threw him to the wolves to save her own skin. She shrieked at the top of her lungs, accusing Colin of being a spectacular failure. She screamed that she had absolutely no idea he was forging medical documents, loudly declaring that he had acted entirely alone. She demanded to know how he could be so incredibly stupid as to commit fraud on camera while she was just trying to maintain their lifestyle. Colin snapped. The crushing humiliation of the evidence, combined with his wife's immediate vicious betrayal, ignited a blind, desperate rage within him. He turned on her, his face flushed dark red spit flying from his lips as he roared back. He pointed at the financial ledger sitting on the table, screaming that the only reason he was driven to forge those documents was because she was bleeding them dry. He cursed her relentless, suffocating greed. He reminded her furiously that while he was risking his freedom to save them from the predatory loan, she was sitting in a luxury hotel suite buying designer shoes with stolen money. The illusion of their unified upper-class marriage violently detonated right there in the sterile conference room. They screamed over each other, hurling devastating insults, tearing into each other's deepest insecurities, completely abandoning any pretense of dignity. They were two parasites, suddenly realizing the host was gone, turning their teeth on each other in a desperate fight for survival. I sat back in my leather chair, perfectly still, watching the destruction unfold. I did not intervene. I did not ask them to lower their voices. I simply watched the inevitable consequence of a life built entirely on lies and unearned entitlement. Natalie's shrill voice pierced the sterile air of the conference room. She frantically pointed her finger at Colin, her face contorted in a mask of sheer panic and vicious self-preservation. She shrieked that she was an absolute victim, that Colin had forced her to use the fraudulent credit cards to maintain the illusion of their wealthy lifestyle in front of her parents. She claimed he was a pathetic, inadequate failure of a husband who could not even afford the luxury car he drove, let alone a premium vacation. She begged me to believe that she was entirely ignorant of his federal forgery crimes, insisting she thought the credit cards were fully authorized by me to cover household expenses. Colin did not absorb the insult quietly. The crushing pressure of the federal evidence shattered whatever fragile loyalty he had left for his wife. His face flushed a deep, violent crimson. He roared back at her, his voice cracking under the sheer terror of his impending arrest. He exposed her deepest, most humiliating secrets right there in front of my attorney. He yelled that she had relentlessly manipulated him into taking out the predatory digital loan, reminding her loudly that she had threatened to file for divorce if she could not show off to her arrogant family on the cruise ship. He called her a parasitic leech who had spent the last 4 years draining his sanity and bleeding my bank accounts dry just to buy designer shoes. I sat perfectly still at the head of the heavy mahogany table. Foster sat beside me, his hands folded neatly over his legal pad, his expression as blank as a stone wall. We did not raise a finger to stop them. We did not ask them to lower their voices. I simply watched the spectacular, violent implosion of their marriage, as they aggressively tore into each other, stripping away every single ounce of their manufactured upper-class dignity. A very specific memory drifted into my mind. When Colin was 26 years old, he partnered with a close university friend to open a small commercial logistics business. I had co-signed the heavy commercial lease for their downtown warehouse. 8 months later, the business collapsed entirely. It failed because Colin had been secretly siphoning the operating funds to pay for expensive weekend trips to Las Vegas. When his friend discovered the missing funds and threatened to sue him for embezzlement, Colin did not face him like a man. He blamed the entire financial failure on a phantom accountant, packed his bags in the dead of night, and hid in my house for weeks. I had paid off the broken lease and settled the missing funds with his friend out of my own pocket just to keep my son out of a courtroom. He had always been a coward. He had always sold out anyone he could to save his own skin. Watching him now desperately throwing the woman he supposedly loved directly under a federal bus just to shield himself from the consequences of his own actions, the very last fragment of my parental grief quietly evaporated. For days, a small, stubborn part of my heart had ached for the son I thought I had lost. I had mourned the boy I had raised, wondering where I had failed him. But looking at the frantic, sweating, vicious man across the table, the truth finally crystallized. I realized I had not lost a son at all. I had simply been hosting a deeply entrenched infection. The pain was completely gone. The lingering sorrow vanished into the cold, sterile air of the room. In its place was a profound, absolute serenity. The mental clarity was almost intoxicating. I was no longer looking at my family. I was looking at 2 drowning criminals frantically trying to pull each other under the water. The shouting match reached a fever pitch. Natalie picked up a glass of ice water from the table and hurled the contents directly at Colin, the freezing liquid splashing aggressively across his wrinkled thrift store shirt. He lunged forward, slamming his fists down on the mahogany table, cursing her existence and blaming her for ruining his life. It was time to end the circus. I raised my right hand high into the air and brought my open palm down hard against the solid, polished wood. The sharp, violent crack echoed through the soundproof glass room like a gunshot. Colin and Natalie froze instantly. The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. The only sound was Colin's heavy, ragged breathing as water dripped from his collar onto the leather chair. They both turned to look at me, their eyes wide with fear, suddenly remembering who held all the power in the room. They waited, trembling, for my verdict. I leaned forward slowly, resting my forearms on the table. My eyes locked onto theirs with the cold, mechanical precision of a predator closing in on its prey. I told them the debate was officially over. I stated clearly that there would be no more negotiating, no more crying, and absolutely no more shifting the blame. I turned my head slightly and looked at Foster, giving him a single silent nod. The time for observation had ended. The final trap was ready to spring shut. The sharp, violent crack of my palm striking the solid mahogany table severed the escalating screaming match instantly. Colin and Natalie froze in their seats, the bitter, venomous insults they had just hurled at each other dying completely on their lips. The sudden silence in the soundproof conference room was absolute and suffocating. They stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, their chests heaving, suddenly remembering who held the ultimate authority over their survival. The pathetic illusion of their united marriage had been obliterated, leaving behind nothing but two panicked strangers waiting for my verdict. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a lecture on morality or familial duty. I simply lowered my hand, interlaced my fingers, and gave a slight, silent nod to the man sitting to my right. Foster did not hesitate. He opened his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out two thick, heavily bound legal portfolios. He slid them smoothly across the polished wood. One came to a halt directly in front of Colin. The other stopped directly in front of Natalie. Colin stared at the portfolio as if it were a live explosive. His hands were trembling so violently he could barely grip the edge of the heavy cardstock cover. He opened it, his bloodshot eyes scanning the dense legal text printed on the crisp white pages. Foster began to speak, his voice entirely devoid of emotion, outlining the inescapable reality of the trap they had just walked into. There were no settlement checks. There were no new lease agreements. There was only the absolute crushing weight of consequence. Foster explained the first document. It was a comprehensive, ironclad admission of civil and financial fraud. The contract legally transferred every single cent of the unauthorized debt exclusively into their names. By signing the document, Colin and Natalie would officially accept total responsibility for the fraudulent credit cards, the stolen identity charges, and the massive predatory loan they had secured at the cruise terminal. They would be legally bound to repay every dollar they had stolen from my accounts, to maintain their fabricated upper-class lifestyle. But Foster had drafted the document with a specific, inescapable mechanism. The contract included a strict, non-negotiable waiver clause. By signing the confession, they explicitly surrendered their right to ever declare bankruptcy on these specific financial liabilities. They would not be permitted to run to a judge, wipe their slates clean, and start over. They would carry the toxic, suffocating weight of this debt for the rest of their natural lives. Every future paycheck they earned would be heavily garnished. Their tax returns would be seized automatically. They would live exactly as they had forced me to live, counting pennies in the dark, constantly terrified of the next collection notice. As Foster detailed the bankruptcy waiver, I watched Natalie process the information. Years ago, before she had married my son, she had accumulated massive retail debt and casually filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, erasing her mistakes with a simple court filing. She had bragged about it once at my kitchen table, calling it a brilliant financial loophole. She firmly believed she could always just press a reset button when her spending caught up to her. I made sure my legal team removed that button entirely. Colin began to shake his head rapidly, his breathing shallow and erratic. He pushed the portfolio away, whispering frantically that he could not sign it, claiming that accepting that level of debt would completely destroy his life. Foster did not blink. He calmly instructed Colin to turn to the second tab in the portfolio. If they refused to sign the financial confession, the second document would immediately be executed. It was a fully drafted, comprehensively evidenced criminal referral. Foster explained that the moment they chose to walk out of the conference room without signing the civil agreement, he would personally hand-deliver the criminal referral directly to the federal prosecutor. The charges listed on the document were staggering: aggravated identity theft, interstate wire fraud, the deliberate forgery of legal and medical documents, attempted financial exploitation of a vulnerable senior citizen. Foster clearly articulated the federal sentencing guidelines associated with the evidence sitting on the table. With the high-definition security footage from the bank and the undeniable financial ledgers, they were looking at a minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. Foster made it explicitly clear that there would be no plea deals, no suspended sentences, and no expensive defense attorneys to save them. The federal government would seize whatever meager assets they had left, and they would spend the next decade in a concrete cell. They were completely, hopelessly trapped. The safety net had been incinerated, and the ground was rushing up to meet them. They had to choose between a lifetime of crippling, inescapable poverty or a decade of federal incarceration. There was absolutely no third option. No path forward existed where they simply walked away unscarred. Natalie stared at the stark black ink on the page, her mind frantically searching for a loophole, a hidden exit, any possible way to manipulate the scenario back into her favor. She looked across the table at me, her eyes wide with a desperate, venomous fury. She finally realized that I was not bluffing. The generous, yielding father she had comfortably exploited for 4 years had been completely eradicated. She slammed her hands flat against the mahogany table and pushed herself up the heavy leather chair, scraping aggressively against the floor. She shrieked at the top of her lungs, declaring that the entire meeting was illegal extortion. She screamed that she would not sign a single page, insisting that no judge in the country would ever uphold a confession signed under extreme duress. She grabbed her cheap thrift store purse, her face flushed with blind, arrogant indignation, and declared she was leaving immediately. She snapped at Colin to get up, swearing that they would find their own ruthless attorney and countersue me for emotional distress and financial sabotage. She turned on her heel and took a confident, defiant stride toward the heavy glass door of the conference room. Foster did not try to stop her. He did not block her path or raise his voice. He simply reached into his tailored suit pocket, pulled out his smartphone, and placed it flat on the mahogany table. His voice cut through the sterile room, crisp, calm, and absolute. He informed Natalie that she was perfectly free to leave the conference room whenever she pleased. However, he casually added that a squad of local police officers was currently waiting in the main lobby on the ground floor. Foster explained that he had contacted the authorities 30 minutes prior to their arrival, providing the precinct with a preliminary copy of the federal bank fraud evidence. He looked directly at Natalie and stated that if she pushed open that glass door without signing the civil confession, the front desk receptionist had strict immediate instructions to send the officers up in the elevator to execute the arrest warrants. Natalie froze instantly. Her hand hovered just inches from the stainless steel door handle. Her defiant, arrogant facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The heavy silver pen rested perfectly parallel to the edge of the financial confession document. The metallic surface caught the harsh fluorescent lighting of the conference room. Colin stared at it as if it were a loaded weapon. He was completely out of moves. The elaborate theater of his thrift store clothing and his manufactured tears had failed spectacularly. His wife had just attempted to flee, only to discover that the lobby downstairs was packed with uniformed officers holding federal arrest warrants. The suffocating reality of his situation finally crushed the last remaining breath from his lungs. If he refused to pick up that pen, he would be wearing handcuffs before he even reached the parking garage. He would lose the next decade of his life to a federal penitentiary. If he signed the document, he would legally assume a mountain of unpardonable toxic debt that would bleed his paychecks dry for the rest of his natural life. He reached out. His hand was shaking so violently that his knuckles rattled against the polished mahogany table. He picked up the heavy silver pen. He suspended the ink just a fraction of an inch above the signature line. His breathing grew ragged and shallow. He looked up, his bloodshot eyes locking onto mine. The mask of the arrogant, entitled son was entirely gone. In its place was a terrified, desperate boy, realizing that his permanent safety net had just been incinerated. Genuine tears streamed down his sunburned cheeks. They were not crocodile tears this time. They were tears of pure, unadulterated fear. "Dad!" He whispered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched plea. "Dad, please. You cannot do this to me. I am your son. I am your only son. Please just give me one more chance. Do not make me sign my life away." I did not blink. I did not shift my weight in the heavy leather chair. I looked at the man sweating and weeping across the table, and I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no sorrow, no lingering parental guilt. I simply leaned forward, resting my forearms against the cool wood, closing the physical distance between us. I looked him dead in the eyes and delivered my final verdict. My voice was calm, steady, and devoid of any warmth. "Plans changed, Colin," I said, repeating the exact words he had sent me on the eve of the cruise. "Your wife only wants her family. I do not belong to that family." The words struck him with the devastating force of a physical blow. The absolute finality of my tone shattered his last remaining hope. He realized in that precise fraction of a second that his own arrogant text message had been the execution order for his comfortable life. He had personally locked the door and thrown away the key. He slumped forward, his shoulders collapsing in utter defeat. A wretched guttural sob escaped his throat. He lowered the pen and pressed the tip to the paper. His hand shook as he dragged the ink across the signature line, legally binding himself to a lifetime of financial ruin. He dropped the pen. He did not look up again. He simply sat there, staring blankly at the tabletop, a broken and hollow shell of a man. Foster did not waste a single second. My attorney smoothly pulled the signed document away from Colin and slid the second copy directly in front of Natalie. He placed the silver pen right beside her trembling hand. Natalie glared at me, her eyes burning with an intense, venomous hatred. She despised me for stripping away her fabricated upper-class identity. She despised Colin for being too cowardly to save her. But most of all, she despised the inescapable reality that she was completely powerless. She looked toward the heavy glass doors of the conference room, imagining the police officers waiting in the lobby below. She knew she had absolutely no escape route. With a sharp, bitter exhale, she snatched the pen from the table. She pressed down so hard that the ink nearly tore through the thick cardstock. She aggressively scribbled her signature next to her husband's name, officially tethering herself to the massive pile of predatory loans and fraudulent credit card debt she had accumulated. She threw the pen down, the metal clattering loudly across the mahogany. Foster calmly gathered the signed confessions. He inspected the signatures, closed the heavy leather portfolios, and slipped them securely into his briefcase. The metallic click of the briefcase latches snapping shut sounded like a jail cell locking into place. "The meeting is adjourned," Foster stated simply. I stood up from my chair. I did not say goodbye. I did not offer any parting advice. I buttoned my suit jacket, turned my back on them, and walked purposefully toward the exit. Foster pushed the heavy glass doors open, holding them wide. Colin and Natalie slowly rose from their leather chairs. They looked physically drained, as if the gravity in the room had suddenly doubled. They walked out of the sterile conference room and stepped into the carpeted hallway. They walked shoulder to shoulder, yet they were light years apart. They did not speak to each other. They did not touch. They stepped into the elevator, descending toward the ground floor. They were walking out of that building as free citizens, having narrowly avoided federal prison, but they were walking straight into a living nightmare. They had no home to return to. Their luxury cars were on the verge of repossession. Their bank accounts were hopelessly overdrawn. And they were permanently shackled to a mountain of toxic debt and a marriage that had just violently, irreparably expired. Foster and I rode the private executive elevator down to the ground floor of the corporate building. The descent was smooth and entirely silent. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the quiet, profound stillness that follows the completion of a long and exhausting task. I thanked my attorney for his flawless execution of the contracts. We walked out through the heavy revolving glass doors of the lobby and stepped onto the bustling pavement of the financial district. The oppressive, suffocating humidity of the early afternoon had finally broken. A sharp, cooling wind swept through the concrete canyon of the city street, signaling an impending violent storm. Massive, bruised clouds were rolling in rapidly over the skyline, blocking out the sun and casting a dark, heavy shadow over the entire block. I paused near the entrance of an upscale coffee shop, blending seamlessly into the crowd of professionals rushing to beat the rain. I did not have to wait long to witness the immediate devastating consequences of the signatures Colin and Natalie had just provided. Just half a block away, parked illegally in a commercial loading zone, sat Colin's sleek silver sports sedan and Natalie's imported white luxury sport utility vehicle. They had driven separately to the mediation, undoubtedly planning to storm off in different directions to celebrate after securing their anticipated financial payout. Instead, they were currently standing completely frozen on the edge of the concrete sidewalk. Two heavy-duty commercial tow trucks were idling aggressively right next to their vehicles. The flashing amber lights illuminated the dark street. Men in bright reflective safety vests were already securing thick steel chains to the front axles of the luxury cars. The rapid financial collapse was absolute and unforgiving. The exact moment Colin and Natalie signed that civil confession legally transferring the massive weight of the fraudulent debt entirely into their names, Foster had instructed his paralegal to electronically transmit the legal documents directly to the respective lending institutions. Corporate creditors do not hesitate when a borrower assumes a toxic, unpardonable debt profile while already carrying severely overdrawn bank accounts. The luxury vehicle leases were terminated immediately through an automated system. The repossession orders had been dispatched and executed with ruthless, terrifying efficiency. Natalie ran forward, her cheap thrift store shoes slapping awkwardly and loudly against the pavement. She shrieked at the tow truck driver, waving her arms frantically in the air, ordering him to unhook her pristine white vehicle immediately. She yelled that it was a simple banking error, claiming her account had been temporarily frozen by mistake, and promising she would have the cash by tomorrow morning. The driver did not even look at her. He simply pulled a heavy metallic lever on his side control panel and hoisted her expensive vehicle high into the air. He handed her a laminated pink slip of paper, climbed into his cab, and drove away. Colin did not even attempt to argue with the second driver. He stood entirely motionless on the sidewalk, his shoulders slumped in total defeat, watching the silver sports car he had proudly leased with my stolen money being dragged unceremoniously onto a flatbed trailer. He looked like a hollow shell of a man. Panic completely consumed Natalie. Her breathing became rapid and incredibly shallow. She dug frantically into her cheap canvas bag and pulled out her smartphone. Her hands were shaking so violently that she nearly dropped the device twice before finally dialing a number. She put the phone on the external speaker, desperately hoping Colin would hear the conversation and feel the immense shame of her having to beg her wealthy parents for a bailout. I stood quietly in the shadows of the coffee shop awning, listening to the absolute destruction of her very last safety net. The call connected. It was her father answering the line. This was the exact same man who had stood on the cruise terminal deck just a week prior, tapping his expensive leather shoes, silently judging Colin for a declined credit card. Natalie did not bother with any pleasantries. She launched directly into a hysterical, sobbing plea. She cried that they had lost their house, that their cars were being towed away on the street, and that Colin had gotten them tangled up in a massive legal and financial disaster. She begged her father to wire them $20,000 immediately. She asked if they could move into his spacious guest house in the neighboring affluent suburb until they got back on their feet. The response from her father was not a warm, protective embrace. It was a cold, sharp, and calculated interrogation. He demanded to know exactly what kind of financial disaster could lead to immediate, simultaneous vehicle repossession and total homelessness. Natalie was backed completely into a corner. She tearfully admitted to the debt, though she tried to minimize it by calling it a minor credit card issue that spiraled out of control. But her father was a wealthy, strategic man who protected his public image and his financial assets above all else. He heard the sheer panic in his daughter's voice and instantly recognized the distinct smell of severe toxic liability. He told his daughter in a voice as rigid and unyielding as frozen steel that he had spent his entire life building his reputation and securing his estate. He explicitly stated that he would never absorb a massive fraudulent debt just because she had chosen to marry an incompetent fool. Natalie begged loudly. She reminded him that she was his only daughter and promised they would pay him back every single cent with interest. Her father simply replied that she was a grown woman who had made her own bed, and she would now have to lie in it. I could hear her mother speaking in the background of the call, firmly agreeing with her husband, stating that they could not risk a federal investigation, bleeding into their own social circle. Her father told Natalie not to bring her financial contamination to his pristine doorstep. He warned her that he would block her number entirely if she attempted to ask for money again. The line went completely dead. The sharp dial tone echoed loudly from the phone speaker. The prestigious, untouchable family she had prioritized over me, the family she had demanded go on the cruise instead of me, had completely abandoned her the very second she became a financial burden. Her arrogant pride evaporated into the humid city air. She stood staring at the dark screen of her phone, totally paralyzed by the rejection. A low, heavy rumble of thunder shook the pavement beneath our feet. The dark sky finally opened up. It did not rain softly. It was a torrential, blinding downpour, the kind of aggressive, relentless storm that instantly floods the city gutters and washes debris into the storm drains. The heavy rain soaked through Colin and Natalie's cheap thrift store clothing in a matter of seconds. The thin, faded fabric clung tightly to their shivering bodies, highlighting their pathetic, broken posture. They had no luxury cars to seek shelter inside. They had no active credit cards capable of paying for a taxi or a private ride service. They had absolutely nowhere to go and no one left to call. Colin slowly bent down and picked up the 2 cheap plastic shopping bags containing the expensive clothes they had worn to the office before changing into their mediation costumes. The thin plastic tore under the heavy weight of the accumulating water, spilling a damp, tailored shirt directly onto the dirty, flooded sidewalk. He did not bother picking it up. He simply stood up, looked at his weeping wife, and began to walk. Natalie stood in the freezing rain for a moment longer, staring blankly at the empty loading zone where her luxury vehicle had been parked just minutes before. She finally lowered her head, the heavy rain flattening her perfectly styled hair against her face, and trudged slowly after him. I watched them walk away down the flooded city block. They were dragging their soaked, worthless belongings toward the industrial district, heading slowly in the direction of the cheap, hourly-rate motels that did not require a credit check or a security deposit. They were walking into a bleak, unforgiving future that they had built entirely with their own hands. I turned my back on the street, pulled up the collar of my dry, custom-tailored wool coat, and stepped smoothly into the warm leather interior of a waiting private town car. The storm was pouring down viciously on the wicked, but inside the vehicle it was perfectly quiet, and I had never felt warmer. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Foster's executive office, bathing the room in a warm golden light. The violent storm that had washed Colin and Natalie down the street just days ago had completely passed, leaving the city sky a brilliant cloudless blue. I sat in a plush leather armchair across from my attorney, a cup of freshly brewed black coffee resting on the coaster beside me. The contrast between my current reality and the miserable, suffocating existence my son was enduring in some rundown motel was not lost on me. But I was not there to gloat. I was there to fundamentally rewrite the future. Foster placed a sleek silver fountain pen on the edge of his massive mahogany desk. He slid a remarkably thick stack of legal documents toward me. These were not contracts designed to inflict pain. These were documents designed to create life. I picked up the pen and looked at the bold print on the first page. It was the official incorporation charter for the Stanley Harper Foundation. For 4 decades, I had poured every ounce of my energy, my sweat, and my financial resources into shielding Colin from the harsh realities of the world. I grew up with absolutely nothing. I was a product of the state foster care system, a boy who wore shoes held together with duct tape and who learned to fight for scrapped meals before he learned how to read. When I finally built my wealth, I made a silent vow that my son would never know what it felt like to be hungry, cold, or afraid of tomorrow. I gave him a life of absolute privilege. I handed him the keys to a kingdom he did not have to build. And in doing so, I had engineered a monster. My unconditional financial safety net had entirely bypassed his character development. He never learned the value of $1 because he never had to bleed for one. I realized that the only way to heal the massive gaping wound in my chest was to take the wealth that had poisoned my own bloodline and use it to elevate those who truly understood the meaning of survival. I directed Foster to consolidate the entirety of my remaining assets. The massive cash reserve from the sale of my house, the healthy retirement portfolios, and the quiet high-yield investments Colin never even knew existed were all pulled together into a single, formidable endowment. I signed my name on the bottom of the charter, legally establishing a multi-million-dollar trust fund specifically structured to provide full-ride university scholarships to young men and women aging out of the foster care system. I was going to pay for the tuition, the housing, and the living expenses of orphans who had the drive to succeed but lacked the financial backing. I was taking the generational wealth Colin had arrogantly thrown away for a cruise and handing it directly to kids who would actually appreciate the opportunity. With every signature, I felt a heavy toxic weight lifting from my shoulders. The suffocating disappointment of raising an ungrateful son was slowly being replaced by a profound, radiant sense of purpose. I was not just giving away money. I was actively buying my own peace of mind. Foster removed the foundation charter and slid the final document across the desk. It was my newly drafted last will and testament. It was concise, clinical, and absolutely lethal in its clarity. I did not simply leave Colin out of the document. Foster had warned me that omitting a child can sometimes lead to lengthy, contested probate battles, as the child can claim they were accidentally forgotten. I wanted to ensure there was absolutely no room for interpretation. I read the specific clause out loud in the quiet, sunlit room. I leave absolutely nothing to my biological son, Colin Harper. I explicitly and intentionally exclude him, his wife, and any of their current or future dependents from my estate. He has already received his inheritance in the form of my past generosity, which he has thoroughly squandered. I pressed the pen to the stark white paper and signed my full name. The stroke of the pen was smooth and definitive. The toxic lineage was officially legally severed. I handed the pen back to Foster. We shook hands, both knowing that the legal fortress we had just constructed was completely impenetrable. 2 days later, the launch of the Stanley Harper Foundation was announced to the public. Because of the sheer size of the initial endowment, the story was picked up by the major local newspapers and several prominent financial blogs. It was featured in a beautifully written full-page spread highlighting my background as a self-made man and detailing the massive scale of the scholarship program. I would later learn exactly how that piece of news finally reached my son, delivering the ultimate psychological death blow. Colin was sitting in the dingy, dimly lit lobby of a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city. He was wearing the same wrinkled clothes he had worn to the mediation. He was surviving on cheap vending machine food, frantically trying to figure out how to navigate the mountain of federal and civil debt that was currently suffocating him. He was entirely alone, as Natalie had already begun to pull away, disgusted by his inability to magically fix their poverty. A discarded copy of the morning newspaper had been left behind on a sticky plastic table in the lobby. Colin sat down heavily, his eyes drifting aimlessly over the pages. He turned the page to the local business section, and his heart stopped entirely. Staring back at him was a high-definition professional photograph of his father standing proudly in front of a local university library. Above the photo was a bold, unmistakable headline detailing the launch of a multi-million-dollar charitable foundation. Colin's hands began to shake violently as he read the article. He read about the sheer staggering volume of the wealth I had just donated to complete strangers. He read the exact dollar amounts of the offshore accounts and the investment portfolios I had quietly accumulated over the decades. He had always assumed I was comfortably middle class. He had assumed my house was my only real asset. He had absolutely no idea that he had been the sole heir to a quiet, massive fortune. The realization hit him with the destructive force of a collapsing building. He saw the millions of dollars that had been entirely his by birthright. He saw the life of absolute, undeniable luxury that he had been destined to inherit. And then he realized exactly what he had traded it for. He had traded a multi-million-dollar empire for a single miserable vacation. He had thrown away a lifetime of financial security just to appease a greedy, superficial wife who was currently packing her bags to abandon him. He had banished me from a cruise, insulted my presence, and tried to steal my house, completely unaware that he was burning down his own castle to do it. The sheer suffocating gravity of his mistake finally crushed whatever fragile sanity he had left. The arrogant illusion he had carried his entire life was completely pulverized. He dropped the newspaper onto the sticky floor, buried his face in his dirty hands, and began to weep. It was a miserable, broken sound that echoed off the cheap motel walls, a sound of absolute, irreversible regret. It was well past midnight, and the city below my new high-rise apartment had settled into a quiet, rhythmic hum. I was sitting in my leather armchair, a single brass reading lamp casting a warm and steady glow across the pages of a novel I had finally found the time to open. My phone rested on the glass coffee table a few feet away. The storm that had washed over the city days ago was entirely gone, leaving behind a crisp, clear night. I was completely at peace. I was enjoying the absolute stillness of a life that belonged entirely to me. Then the screen of my phone illuminated the dark space. It began to vibrate, the sudden aggressive buzzing sound, shattering the profound tranquility of the room. I set my book down on the side table and leaned forward. I looked at the glowing screen. The caller identification simply read unknown number. Under normal circumstances, I would have ignored it and let the device return to sleep. But a quiet, undeniable instinct deep within my chest told me exactly who was desperately trying to reach me from the other end of the line. I reached out, picked up the device, and pressed the green button to accept the call. I brought the receiver to my ear, and I did not say a single word. I heard the sound of heavy, ragged breathing. It was followed by a wet, pathetic sniffle, and then a harsh, guttural sob that echoed through the small speaker. "Dad," a voice croaked. It was Colin. He sounded completely unrecognizable. The arrogant, entitled tone that had so confidently banished me from a luxury cruise just weeks ago was entirely eradicated. The sheer arrogance that had driven him to try and steal my home had evaporated into the cold night air. He sounded exactly like a terrified, helpless child who had just woken up alone in a pitch-black room. "Dad, please do not hang up on me," he pleaded, his voice cracking violently under the weight of his own despair. "Please, I am begging you, just listen to me for 1 minute." I remained perfectly silent. I leaned back into the comfort of my leather armchair, resting my free hand on the cool armrest. I allowed him to speak into the vast, empty space between us. I was going to let him deliver the performance he had undoubtedly been rehearsing in his head for hours. He began to pour out his misery in a frantic, unbroken stream of consciousness. He told me that his entire world had collapsed. He told me that Natalie was gone. She had lasted exactly 4 days in the squalor of that cheap, hourly-rate roadside motel. The very second she realized there was no hidden loophole, no secret family bailout, and absolutely no way to escape the crushing weight of the federal debt they had assumed in that conference room. Her loyalty completely vanished. Colin wept openly as he explained the humiliating details of her departure. He had walked to a nearby gas station in the pouring rain to buy cheap, instant noodles for their dinner. When he returned to the damp, moldy motel room, her cheap canvas suitcase was gone. She had taken the last $20 from his wallet and disappeared. She had left a single sheet of hotel stationery on the unmade bed. It was a hastily written notice of her intent to file for an immediate divorce. She explicitly blamed him for ruining her life and her credit score. She had officially fled, returning to whatever dark corner she came from, leaving him entirely alone to drown in the massive ocean of financial ruin they had built together. He sobbed uncontrollably into the phone, the sound raw and wretched. He told me he was freezing. He told me he had not eaten a real meal in 3 days. He begged me for a second chance, swearing blindly that the shock of losing everything had finally opened his eyes. He promised me that he had learned his lesson. He swore he would do absolutely anything to earn his way back into my good graces. He frantically listed the things he was willing to endure. He promised he would work manual labor, sweep warehouse floors, scrub public toilets, and hand every single meager paycheck directly over to me to repay what he had stolen. He pleaded for me to just tell him what city I was in, to just let him sleep on the floor of my kitchen, to just allow him to be my son again. I sat in the quiet warmth of my living room and listened to every single desperate syllable. I analyzed the high pitch of his voice, the frantic rhythm of his breathing, and the sheer desperation fueling his promises. A decade ago, hearing my son cry like this would have shattered my heart into a million irreparable pieces. I would have moved heaven and earth to rescue him from his pain. I would have wired money instantly, booked him a first-class flight to my location, and welcomed him back with open arms, convinced that my love could heal his flaws. But tonight, sitting in the dark, I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional detachment was profound and incredibly liberating. I understood with crystal clarity that Colin was not apologizing because he loved me. He was not weeping because he suddenly realized the depth of his disrespect, or because he genuinely missed the man who had raised him. He was weeping because he was incredibly uncomfortable. His remorse was not born from a sudden moral awakening or a heavy conscience. His remorse was born entirely from his newly acquired poverty. I knew in my bones that if he still possessed the luxury sports car, the spacious suburban house, and the premium cruise tickets, he would not be calling me. He would still be laughing at my expense, entirely content to leave me rotting in the background of his life while he spent my hard-earned money. He did not want his father back. He simply wanted his permanent, unconditional financial safety net back. He was a parasite desperately trying to reattach itself to a host because it was currently starving to death. I let his crying run its course until he finally ran out of breath. He waited on the other end of the line, panting softly, desperate for a lifeline. He was praying for the familiar sound of my yielding, forgiving voice to wash over him and assure him that everything was going to be fine. I took a slow, deep breath, and I spoke. "You made a conscious choice to burn our bridge to the ground, Colin," I said. My voice was incredibly calm, measured, and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. "You chose to view my lifelong kindness as a weakness to be exploited. You chose to banish me from your life the exact second you thought you no longer needed me to pay your bills. You threw me away so you could look impressive to a woman who just abandoned you in a dirty motel room." He let out a weak, pathetic whimper, trying to interrupt me to offer another hollow excuse, but I did not stop speaking. "You do not miss me, Colin. You just miss the money. You miss the comfort of never having to face the consequences of your own arrogant actions. But that comfort is gone. I am gone. You demanded a life without my presence, and I have granted your request permanently. Now you must live with the absolute reality of that choice." He let out a desperate, high-pitched wail. He begged me not to leave him out in the cold. He cried that he would not survive on the streets, that the debt collectors were already calling his phone day and night. He asked me how he was supposed to fix a mistake of this magnitude all by himself. I did not raise my voice. I simply delivered my final piece of advice to the man I used to call my son. "Save yourself, Colin," I stated firmly into the receiver, letting the absolute finality of the words sink in. Save yourself exactly the way I saved myself. I pulled the phone away from my ear, physically cutting off the sound of his frantic, pleading screams. I pressed the red button on the screen to end the call. The silence rushed back into my living room, instantly settling over the space like a thick, comforting blanket. I opened the call log on my digital screen. I selected the unknown number that had just completely laid bare its misery, and I pressed the option to block the caller permanently. The digital confirmation appeared on the screen, signaling that the cord was officially and irreversibly severed. I set the phone face down on the glass coffee table. I leaned back into my leather chair and looked out the window at the endless expanse of city lights glittering in the dark. I felt no lingering guilt. I felt no sorrow. I simply picked up my novel, found my place on the page, and continued to read, completely undisturbed by the storm I had permanently left behind. The morning sun crested over the horizon, casting a brilliant, blinding sheet of gold across the surface of the lake below my balcony. I stood by the glass railing of my new high-rise apartment, feeling the crisp, cool morning breeze brush against my face. For the first time in over 4 years, I had slept through the entire night without waking up to the sound of heavy footsteps, slammed doors, or whispered arguments echoing down the hallway. The profound, absolute silence of my new home was not empty. It was entirely full of peace. I turned away from the breathtaking view and walked back into my spacious, sunlit kitchen. I measured out fresh coffee grounds, the rich, dark aroma filling the pristine room. I did not have to tiptoe across the floorboards to avoid waking a son who had spent the night out drinking. I did not have to find my favorite coffee mug shoved to the back of a cabinet behind a row of expensive imported teas that a daughter-in-law had bought using my credit card. Every single item in this space belonged to me. Every quiet moment was entirely mine to spend exactly as I saw fit. I poured the steaming black coffee into my ceramic mug and walked over to my leather armchair. I sat down heavily, letting the soft material support my back, and took a long, slow sip. I closed my eyes and listened to the silence. It was a completely different kind of quiet than the one I had endured in my old house. The silence back then was suffocating, built on unspoken resentments and the constant crushing anxiety of wondering when the next financial disaster would strike. The silence I was experiencing right now was the sound of absolute, unconditional freedom. It was a priceless commodity, and I had purchased it with my own courage. I realized that morning that the fear of loneliness is the greatest weapon manipulative people use to keep you trapped. Colin and Natalie had banked on the assumption that an old widower would rather endure their daily disrespect than face the prospect of living out his final years completely alone. They severely misunderstood the nature of my solitude. Being alone was not a punishment. It was a sanctuary. I had successfully excised a malignant tumor from my life, and the recovery process was nothing short of miraculous. My chest no longer ached with the heavy toxic burden of an ungrateful child. I felt lighter, stronger, and more clear-headed than I had in decades. I set my coffee mug down on the glass table and picked up a small stack of mail that Foster had forwarded to me from the Foundation office the previous afternoon. Most of the envelopes were official bank statements and tax documents relating to the newly established trust fund, but nestled at the very bottom of the pristine white envelopes was a slightly wrinkled beige envelope. It was addressed to me in careful, deliberate handwriting. I slid my finger under the paper flap and opened it. Inside was a single piece of lined notebook paper. It was not a corporate update or a legal brief. It was a handwritten letter from the very first recipient of the Stanley Harper Foundation Scholarship Program. I unfolded the paper and began to read. The letter was from a 19-year-old boy who had aged out of the state foster care system just 6 months prior. He wrote that before he received the call from my foundation director, he had been sleeping in the back seat of a rusted sedan, working 2 minimum wage jobs just to afford enough food to survive the week. He had been accepted into a prestigious university engineering program, but had completely given up hope of ever attending because he could not secure the crushing student loans without a co-signer. He wrote that my scholarship had not just paid for his tuition and his campus housing. It had literally saved his life. He promised me with a fierce and genuine sincerity bleeding through the blue ink that he would not waste a single second of the opportunity I had given him. He swore he would graduate at the top of his class and build a life that would make me proud. He thanked me for being the father figure he had never known. I read the final sentence 3 times. A warm, overwhelming wave of emotion swelled in my chest. It was not the bitter, agonizing sorrow I had felt when dealing with Colin. It was a pure, radiant, and absolute joy. A single tear escaped my eye and rolled slowly down my weathered cheek. It was a tear of profound fulfillment. I carefully folded the letter and placed it gently on the table next to my coffee. For years, I had allowed my biological son to siphon my wealth, hoping that my endless generosity would eventually transform him into a responsible, honorable man. I had failed to realize that true legacy cannot be forced onto someone who feels entirely entitled to it. A true legacy must be built by empowering those who know what it means to struggle, to fight, and to survive. I looked back out the massive windows at the glittering lake below. The dark, suffocating storm of the past month had completely passed, leaving behind a horizon that was vibrant, clear, and limitless. I had permanently lost a fabricated, toxic family, but in the process, I had found my true purpose. I had successfully transformed a legacy of entitlement into an engine of genuine hope. My story is not a tragedy about a father who lost his son. It is a triumph about a man who finally remembered his own worth. I learned the hardest lesson of my life in my twilight years, but the lesson remains absolute. Your dignity and your self-respect are the most valuable assets you will ever possess. They cannot be stolen by greedy relatives, they cannot be manipulated by false guilt, and they can never be compromised. You simply have to find the courage to stand up, lock the door, and walk away. And when you finally do, you will discover that the view from the other side is absolutely spectacular.